All right. Hi, everybody. Welcome back to Tundra Buggy 1 on the shores of western Hudson Bay outside of Churchill, Manitoba. We're with you again to kick off polar bear season and our polar bear cams this week. .org, who we're working with along with Frontiers North Adventures to bring to you live polar bears right outside our window. So we have some special guests on board today we'll get to in just a moment, but we want to take a peek at what we're looking at outside there. So we have had a polar bear sleeping in that area during the day. Steve, can you see him out there? Did he move? We're going to keep an eye out for him. I know some of you got some fantastic screenshots that you've been posting. Thank you so much for that.
I can see him right now.
Looks like he might be taking a stroll, but we're going to keep our eye out. And oh, there he is. I think BJ's got him on the cam there. So this is on the Tundra Buggy 1 cam. So this is our mobile broadcasting studio, and we are going to drive around later once we wrap up here and go find more bears. But remember, you can always watch our other polar bear cams. We've got 2 on the Tundra Buggy Lodge, and then 2 out at Cape Churchill in Wapusk National Park. So keep an eye on those. And I love the posts that you guys pull from the screens there. They are just awesome and often very funny. So I'm with a special guest today. I'm Elisa McCall with Polar Bears International, and I'm sitting with Polar Bears International's Chief Scientist, Dr. Steve Amstrup.
Hi there.
Steve, can you introduce yourself just a little bit about your background?
Yeah, I have been with Polar Bears International since 2010, and before that I was in charge of polar bear research for the U.S. Geological Survey in Alaska. So most of my on-the-ground research in Alaska, with polar bears, was in Alaska. In my
Sorry, we're just,
my
BJ's helping us with
Yeah.
some audio here.
oh,
Yeah, this audience is used to our technical difficulties. Here we go.
so maybe I'll start over.
Sure.
So prior to joining Polar Bears International in 2010, I was in charge of polar bear research in Alaska for 30 years. I was employed by the U.S. Geological Survey, and there I was doing work like radio collaring bears, putting ear tags on them, capturing them, weighing them, marking them, measuring them, and that sort of thing. And so over the course of 30 years, we learned a lot about movements, distribution, population dynamics, denning, and that sort of thing. And now I'm here in a very different environment with Elisa.
Thanks, Steve. So please send us your questions. You can put them in the explore.org chat box, and I believe also on Facebook, if that's where you're watching us today. We love answering questions from you guys. So I just wanted to touch briefly on the theme of today. We kind of have themes for each live chat, but really all our chats with Explore are about answering viewers' questions and knowing what you guys want to hear. But this year we did want to call attention to a celebration in Canada. It is Canada's 150th birthday this year, which has been very exciting. And exciting for polar bears because Canada has 2/3 of the world's polar bears. There are 13 populations out of 19 populations of polar bears. 13 live in Canada. And there's a lot of really great research that happens with different universities and our Canadian government. And so we are going to be posting more about Canadian polar bears this year. And if you follow social media, if you can follow Polar Bears International on Facebook or Twitter, we have a fun hashtag right now called Polar Bear Proud. So if you look up hashtags Polar Bear Proud, we're going to be doing that for a whole year, and we love to hear reasons from Canadians, but also from anyone else why you are proud to have polar bears in your country or know about polar bears, or maybe you have one in your local zoo that you love and your zoo does a great job. So any reason that makes you proud that you know or have polar bears nearby, we would love to hear it. And we're going to be posting more photos online about that, so check that out. So we already have some questions coming in, so let's get right to those. And we're very lucky we have Steve as one of the world's leading experts on polar bears, so he can do most of the talking, and I can just send you the questions, Steve. So our first question is, how long do polar bears live?
Well, in the wild, polar bears can live up into their early 30s. I think the oldest bear that we had on record in our studies in Alaska lived to be 33 years old. But it's more typical for females to live maybe into the mid-20s, maybe early 20s, and males the late teens, early 20s. Like most large mammals, male polar bears don't live as long as female polar bears, and this is partly because throughout their life, from the beginnings when they're cubs, males are starting to learn how to compete for each other, ultimately with each other, and that competition ultimately ends up being males just simply wear out a little sooner than females do.
And the oldest polar bear on record was a bear in captivity, so it's easier to live in a zoo for polar bear. You don't have to walk tens of thousands of kilometers or worry about where your next meal is coming from. But the oldest polar bear was actually in Winnipeg at the Assiniboine Park Zoo, and her name was Debbie, and she lived to be 42 years old.
Yeah.
And Churchill feels a special connection to Debbie, so that's a nice fact there. Steve?
Debbie was a star of the Winnipeg Zoo for a long, long time.
She was. And actually, her ashes are spread out here on Polar Bear Point up in Churchill. When she passed years ago, they brought her ashes up back home, so that's a really nice thing. All right, next question. Do polar bears hibernate?
Polar bears don't hibernate in the way that we normally think of them. When we talk about hibernators, there's kind of two classes of animals. There's small mammals, like ground squirrels, and they'll go into a lair or a den or a hole in the ground, and they'll drop their body temperature down almost to freezing. Polar bears don't drop their body temperatures like that, but polar bears are more advanced, and other bears for that matter, are more advanced in the way that they go into their den than some of the small mammals are. Those small mammals that drop their body temperatures so much periodically will arouse themselves during the denning or during the hibernation, and during that arousal period they'll eat a little bit, they'll drink a little bit, they'll urinate and defecate. Bears in dens, they'll go in and they might be more alert than those ground squirrels or other small mammals, but they will spend the whole winter without eating or drinking or urinating or defecating. So among scientists who study hibernation, there's kind of a debate. Are bears really hibernators or not? And, I think they are, but if you go to the small mammal definition, you might think that they aren't. But in many ways, I think they're more advanced than the small mammals. Another big difference is that bears do not lower their temperature so much. So they'll lower their temperature just a few degrees below activity levels, and comparing that to a ground squirrel that might be just above freezing.
Oh, that's so interesting. In the kind of theme of dens, baby polar bears are born in dens. How big are they born? How big are they when they're born? And are there more than one born at a time?
Polar bears, and all bears for that matter, are born very small. In the case of polar bears, a 500 or 600 pound female might have a cub that weighs only 1.5 pounds. And they're essentially hairless, they're blind, and they're totally helpless when they're born. But once they're born, they grow very rapidly because polar bear milk is really, really rich. It's almost like whipping cream. And so these cubs grow very rapidly, and by the time they emerge from the den, about 3 months after they're born, that's when they look like the baby bears that we think of, where they're, maybe 10 or 15 kilograms and looking like we typically think of as bear cubs. But those are actually 3 months old or so.
Oh, nice. They get pretty cute in those. Well, they're always cute, but even cuter after a couple months.
They're not so cute when they're first born.
No, they're really
I'll give them that. They look kind of like drowned rats with no tails.
We've got so many great questions coming in. What is the current population in total, and then specifically in this area?
So the global population of polar bears is thought to be around 20,000. But we have to remember that that's a combination of estimates from places where we know quite a lot about bears. Like here in Hudson Bay, we know that the population here is around 800 bears in western Hudson Bay. Most of the polar bear range, we only have much more crude estimates, or in some places even just educated guesses. So you combine the places where we know a lot about bears and the places where we don't know very much about them and we have some idea, and add those numbers up, and it's about 20,000. Was there another part to that?
And then in this specific area, how much do we know about the size of the population?
Well, the size of the population in western Hudson Bay is probably known better than any place else in the world of the polar bear. But they've been studied for a longer period here than any place else. It's a little bit easier to study polar bears in the Hudson Bay area because they come ashore every summer. Unlike in Alaska, where I studied, most of the bears spent their whole life out on the sea ice, and you always had to go offshore to find them. Here, the bears have always, at least in human terms, spent a couple of months at least on land. And when they're on land, they're a little bit easier to catch. They're a little bit easier to put radio collars on and things like that researchers want to do. And so there's a lot known about the movements, the distribution, where these bears den. And perhaps the most important thing that we know about them is because of declining sea ice, these bears that have been studied so long have given us a record of what the impact of that declining sea ice is. And over the last 30 years, these bears are having to spend about a month longer on land than they used to. And that has resulted in less time for them to feed, more time that they're food deprived, and the population has declined from around 1,200 in the late 80s to around 800 or so now. So we know a lot about these. This population is now around 800, but has changed quite dramatically over the last 30 years.
And Steve makes an excellent point that we know so much about these bears because they do come on land at this time of year, and that's why we're able to put them on the polar bear cam. And for those of you that might be new to the cams or would like a refresher, I'll just provide a little context of why are we able to get so close to polar bears right now. Well, polar bears are currently waiting for the sea ice to return to Hudson Bay. Like Steve was saying, they need sea ice to hunt their main prey, seals. It's only seals that have enough calories through their blubber to help polar bears persist and survive in the wild. So polar bears in this area are used to coming on shore in the summer when the sea ice in Hudson Bay completely melts, and then it completely refreezes in late November or December. So these bears will be leaving us hopefully shortly, but they probably have at least another month or so on land. And they're here right now because they have some maybe innate sense, whether that's light or temperature or whatnot, that they're starting to congregate towards the coast. They know that this area is one of the first areas that will see sea ice in all of Hudson Bay and within their range. And so we do start to see more bears at this time of year walking through the area. And really, they're not caring too much about us. They're not here to see us. They're here to wait for the ice. But we're here to see them. And we are safe in these tundra buggies. And the roads that we travel on are old military roads out here. So we aren't driving straight to that bear that you've seen on the cam. We're staying on the road and trying to zoom in the cam as much as we can. And then later we'll keep driving along those roads until we get to the lodge and seeing what we see along the way. All right.
I'd like to add something to what Elisa just said. So the tundra buggies that tourists ride in and the research buggy, the media buggy that we're talking to you from now, we have to stay on these trails. And so if bears were of a personality that they didn't want to be around the buggies, they wouldn't have to be. All they'd have to do is move a few yards away into the bushes and we'd never see them. Mm-hmm. And so people often are asking, well, don't those big buggies trundling around out there have a negative impact on the bears? And it's not at all clear that there's any negative impact because the bears that might not like it, they just don't come around. And the others are just like this one that we're looking at out here, just laying there and oblivious to us. So I think that's a question we often get, and I think it's a really important one to emphasize, that it doesn't appear that there's any negative influence of these activities, these tourist activities, on the bears themselves. Mm-hmm. And I wanted to also add one other thing to, when Elisa was talking about the bears here waiting for the ice to freeze up again, in about 3/4 of the world's polar bear populations live in places where historically they didn't ever come ashore, or they only came ashore rarely, including to create maternal dens. Hudson Bay and other parts of this sort of the eastern Canadian Arctic is what I called the seasonal ice ecoregion, and this is the part of the polar bear range where bears are forced ashore because the ice melts entirely. It's what we call annual ice. So there's no multi-year ice flows out there in Hudson Bay. In Alaska, where I did most of my research, there used to be lots of multi-year ice, and the bears almost never came ashore. And it's that way in Svalbard and much of northern Canada. The bears very seldom come ashore, but here, the bears have always come ashore, and the challenge that they're facing now is they're having to be on shore for a longer period. In other parts of the Arctic, the challenge is that the ice is withdrawing from the favored hunting areas. So in the Beaufort Sea, there may still be sea ice in the summertime, but it's a couple hundred miles offshore instead of in that shallow nearshore water where there's more seals and greater overall productivity.
Thanks for that, Steve. I think it's so interesting that no matter where a polar bear is, it needs sea ice to survive, but there are some really interesting differences between some of the populations with what they have to deal with. And like Steve was saying, your paper looking at the different types of sea ice in those ecoregions, and that's something that is on our website and that we can post if people are interested in seeing that. So fascinating, and the seasonal ecoregion is just one more reason that, Canadian polar bears are pretty darn interesting, as are all polar bears. But we have a lot of questions coming in. This is fantastic. So here's kind of a fun one, Steve. I think it's a fun one. Now, would it help the species to bring some polar bears inland to breed with brown bears?
Well, there's been a lot of news about brown bear and polar bear hybridization, and I'm actually going to let you cover that since that was a finding of the lab that you came from at the University of Alberta. I think the short answer is that it wouldn't really help polar bears if we brought them in to breed with grizzly bears. And why is that? Those of us that are concerned about polar bears are concerned about preserving the current life form. We want to see these giant white bears roaming around in this moonscape environment forever. And to imagine that what would be left of a polar bear is a few genes floating around in an animal that's something like a grizzly bear is not really what excites us very much. So I think the answer is I don't think it's such a great idea, but you might want to talk more specifically about the most recent findings on the hybrids.
Sure. So we do know that polar bears and brown bears can in fact breed and have offspring that also are able to breed, but we know that those hybrids aren't necessarily very fit for their environment. There were a few, I think it was 6 to 8 bears, growler bears we call them. So when we talk about a hybrid, the father's name goes first and then the mother, so grizzly fathers and polar mother. And these growler bears were spotted all in one area. I believe it was Victoria Island in northern Canada. And there was a lot of curiosity for quite a few years whether this was going to continue to happen. Would it become more widespread? Was this going to be a new species of bear? And in fact, what we found that these hybrids trace back to simply one polar bear female that mated with 2 brown bear males. So we don't think that we'll see a lot more of this. And from what I know about the hybrids, they weren't very well suited for the ice, and they weren't very well suited for terrestrial living. So grizzly bears are very well adapted to live on land. Their claws, actually, maybe I can show you right now. I don't know if BJ's able to zoom in on this, but these bears have very different characteristics for living in these different habitats. So here is a brown bear. I'm going to show like that maybe. A brown bear claw.
You want me to hold
Yeah,
on?
maybe Steve against his nice blue shirt that'll be a little easier to see. There you go. So you can see how it's longer, not quite a sharp point. These are nicely suited for maybe digging, flipping, getting roots. Just way better for land. And then the polar bear claw, Steve, you made my Vanna White. The polar bear claw is much thicker. It's more sharply curved. This is really more suited for walking on sea ice and grabbing seals and pulling seals out of seal holes. And this is just one difference of many, many differences between these two species. Polar bears have weaker jaw strength actually than brown bears, not by a lot, still very strong jaws, but grizzly bears and brown bears need to bite through more meat and bone and tough materials, whereas seals are squishier. So polar bears don't need to bite as hard. They have different teeth. Polar bears have teeth that are much more suited for, I'll show you, why don't I show you our skull too? More suited for meat and fat, whereas brown bears would have and actually maybe Steve could talk more about that, but their back teeth are more suited for grinding, more vegetation. Their diets are very different. Oh yeah, look at that, looks great.
So if you look at when these jaws close, you'll see that the first teeth behind the big canine teeth are those couple of small teeth, and then there's a couple of teeth that almost have a scissors-like action. Those are called carnassials. And if I can hold up so this tooth right here, that premolar tooth, bears down on the one below it and doesn't actually hit it, but goes beside it in a shearing motion. And those teeth are like the teeth that cats have. Cats probably have the most pronounced carnassial teeth, and they're designed for shearing skin, blubber, and muscle. if this was a grizzly bear skull, these molar teeth would be much bigger, more massive, and that's because they do spend more time scavenging, breaking bones and things like that, like Elisa pointed out, and also because they eat a lot of vegetation. And so they use those teeth for grinding vegetation. Polar bears almost eat no vegetation. Sometimes you'll see them eat a little grass and things like that, but very rarely. And so they're principally carnivores, much more carnivorous than any of the other bear species. They pretty much, in fact, Elisa's major professor at the University of Alberta calls them lipivores.
Yeah.
He says they mainly eat fat. And healthy polar bears will eat mostly fat. They'll kill a seal, they'll strip the fat off and maybe eat some of the organs, and then they leave the rest. And the parts that are available for scavenging feed Arctic foxes, and they also feed subadult bears that come along and may not be quite as good at catching seals, but they can find those remains.
Thank you, Steve. So yeah, we've got one bear very well suited for land and the other very well suited for sea ice, and the mix of the two just doesn't, we don't think it's going to be a savior to the polar bears. And like Steve said, we want to see the polar bear in the Arctic.
Yeah, one of the questions related to that that I've often gotten is it climate change? Is it global warming that's causing these hybrids to occur? And as Elisa just pointed out, it's actually only been one female that happened to encounter just a couple of male grizzly bears. So it really isn't a common phenomenon by any means. But if you think about it, currently the changes in the sea ice that we're seeing are most prevalent in the late summer and the fall. And breeding season for both grizzly bears and polar bears is in the spring. And so they are breeding at the time of year when there's still the maximum amount of sea ice. And if you look at the changes that we've seen in the sea ice, the minimal changes have been at that time of year. So it's not like the ice has disappeared and all the polar bears are running onto shore and encountering grizzly bears. That isn't the case. Global warming probably has very little, if anything, to do with this chance encounter between a couple of male grizzly bears and a female polar bear. I would want to correct one thing, though. Since I'm kind of partial to polar bears, I call them Pisleys.
Oh, okay. Oh, I didn't know that was an option. I do like the name better. I think it's a lot funnier. All right, well, maybe we'll go with Pisleys. All right. Well, I just dropped the claws. I'll get those later.
Yeah.
Is it true that polar bears' tongues are purple?
Wow. I guess that they kind of have a purple cast.
Kinda.
Yeah, I don't know that I would say, oh, that's a purple tongue. It's not like the Minnesota Vikings football uniforms.
Oh, yeah.
But it is, I guess it does have kind of a purple cast.
Oh,
Yeah.
maybe if we get close enough. Sometimes we see them yawning out here. Maybe we can try to snap a shot of a polar bear tongue for you.
Yeah.
That's pretty neat. And how fast can polar bears run?
Polar bears, especially the younger, thinner ones, can run over 30 miles an hour for a short distance. They can be incredibly fast over a short distance, but over the long run, they typically don't do a lot of running around out here. Oh. And one of the things that our studies showed, and subsequent some of the work over here as well, has shown that they mostly just walk around on the ice. They don't run very often. Now they run. When we were doing our research in Alaska and the research that they do here, surely they run from a helicopter. And I think everybody in the audience would run from a helicopter if they thought it was chasing them. So, but normally they just don't spend a lot of time running. They will, when they're stalking a seal that's hauled out on the ice, sneak up as close as they can, and then there'll be an explosive charge to try and catch that seal before it jumps into the ice. And it's during those kind of events that they can exceed 30 miles an hour. But they wear out pretty quickly, and you wouldn't expect them to be going that fast for very long.
You definitely wouldn't want to try to race one.
There's a video that I saw years ago that it was a safety in bear country video. Did you ever see this one? And it started out with showing a cartoon character running the 100-yard dash, and it said, "The world's fastest human can run the 100-yard dash in," I forget what it was, 9 seconds, 9.1, whatever it was. And then it showed a bear running next to the human. And the bear dramatically outdistanced the human over that 100-yard period or 100-yard distance. And then it said, and remember, you are not the world's fastest human.
We might have to get a clip of that for BJ to show everybody. We'll take a look. That's hilarious. Oh, gosh. Okay, this is an interesting one. Is there a reason that there is not an effort to feed the polar bears when they are starving?
Well, I guess that the main reason is, and this is something that a lot of people have talked about, and as scientists we've thought about it, the problem that polar bears are facing is that by contributing greenhouse gases, principally CO2, to the atmosphere, we're warming the world, causing the ice to melt. They get their food from the surface of the sea ice. So maybe if this was a transient event, localized in a small area, it would be appropriate to feed them for a while if we knew the ice was coming back. Unfortunately, at this point, the ice is on a downhill slide, and unless we take dramatic action as a global society, it's going to continue to decline. So we would end up having to feed all the bears in the world. A few years ago, I did a sort of a back-of-the-envelope calculation of what it would take to feed just these polar bears here in western Hudson Bay a reasonable subsistence diet that would allow them to survive a little bit longer until they went out on the ice, if the ice was coming in much, much later. And it was well over $1 million a month. Whoa. And this is the most accessible of all polar bear populations. And so if you think about the cost of that, the greenhouse gas footprint of doing something like that, because that would involve flying with big airplanes and dropping food all along the beach from here up into Nunavut, it just is not very practical. So I think that that's the main reason. I mean, it's not an idea that people haven't talked about. It just isn't very practical. And what we really need to focus on is saving the sea ice habitat. And we know what we need to do that.
Absolutely. And what would be the effect of drilling for oil in the Arctic on the polar bear population?
The impact of drilling for oil is, in and of itself, going out into the Arctic, either on land or in the marine environment, and drilling is probably a minimal impact if everything went perfectly and there were no problems. The problem is that on land, when there's oil and gas development, there ends up being a lot of infrastructure, more human access, and so the humans then become more of an influence in habitats that they formerly weren't in. So these tundra areas around here, except for this little network of roads, which is very limited, and the kind of access out here is very limited. If suddenly there was huge networks of roads out here connecting oil wells, that could have a direct impact behaviorally and otherwise on the bears. And then if you're talking about drilling in the marine environment, and there's a lot of talk being renewed about that in Alaska, there's always the risk of a spill. And oil spills in the marine environment, in the Arctic marine environment in particular, are a very difficult thing to control. We really have no technology to get a handle on any kind of a major spill. And many in the audience are probably familiar with the Exxon Valdez and the mess that it created, the economic impact, the ecological impact. It was huge, and that was not in Arctic ice-covered waters. If we had something like that in ice-covered waters, it would be the oil spilled off of Alaska would end up going around the world probably before it ever got cleared up.
Wow, scary stuff.
Yeah, so, theoretically, you could have oil and gas development with minimal impact, but in practice, I think it would be a very difficult thing to do, especially in the marine environment. Now, I will say that the oil companies that have worked on the North Slope of Alaska have done a really good job of being good neighbors. And we have not measured an impact of oil and gas activity from that land-based oil and gas activity. And when bears come ashore and interact with the people, they're doing a very good job of keeping the bears and the people separate and not interfering with the bears. So it is possible to do it. But you have to think of all the variables, and they've had a lot of time in Alaska to think of the variables. And then if you move offshore, it's a different ballgame.
Right. Well, it's good to know that there's some success stories out there and people are taking the polar bear seriously and doing what they can.
Yeah, when I worked in Alaska, we partnered a lot with representatives from the oil and gas companies, and they still are major supporters of some of our work at PBI. And they are doing a really good job of minimizing their footprint, minimizing their impact, not only on polar bears, but on all of the wildlife up there, because it's important for them to put forward a position that, you know, we're after this one resource, but we also want to minimize the impact on these others, and we know that sometimes there could be conflicts. So it can be done. It can be done if there's a lot of care. In the marine environment, it will be a lot more difficult.
Okay. So I don't know the answer to this, and I don't know if you do, Steve, but it's interesting questions. How thick does the ice have to be to support an adult polar bear's weight? Or it might be pretty dependent, I would think.
Polar bears are incredibly able to walk on very, very thin ice. And I've experienced this a couple of times catching bears in the fall of the year in Alaska when the ice was so thin that when we landed the helicopter, and we had a helicopter with fixed floats, so even if the ice broke through, it would float. But we landed the helicopter, and it would just, the ice would bow down like this, because saltwater ice is flexible. It's kind of got
Neat.
plastic characteristics compared to freshwater ice. If you put too much weight on it, it just breaks. Saltwater ice will first deform.
Okay.
And but there were a couple of times that we were out, we darted a bear that got into some of this really thin ice, and that bear was just walking along, and we thought, wow, we should be able to do that. And we landed, and the helicopter floated because it was on the floats, big surface area, and we got out and right away started to punch through.
Gosh.
So we had to figure out creative ways to handle those bears. And you know, after having that learning experience, we were a little bit more careful in how we, how we handled or how we darted bears and make sure that they couldn't get to that skinny ice. But I suppose that an adult bear can walk on ice that's only a couple inches thick.
Wow.
But an adult person, maybe not so much.
That's amazing. And part of that is because of the size of the polar bear's paws. Is that right? They just even out their weight over all their giant paws. Yeah. And next time I'll show you a paw cast, but their paws are bigger than my face pretty easily. And we've also seen out here before too the polar bear starfish. Have you ever seen that? When they can really spread their legs out and kind of shuffle around almost on their bellies. It's neat to see them get across that really thin ice occasionally that way. So
yeah, they know very well after living, after having evolved in this environment, they know how to contend with really thin ice.
Definitely. Thank you for all these questions. We have time for a couple more. Let's see this is an interesting question. It's about Hudson Bay though. So the salinity of Hudson Bay and the surrounding water around here, what is the freezing point temperature for Hudson Bay? So I guess how cold would it have to be for this salt water and brackish water around here before it actually freezes into ice for polar bears?
In general, salt water freezes at, I think it's 28 Fahrenheit, which is what, -2 or thereabouts, -1.5 Celsius, something like that. So quite a bit below the freezing level of fresh water.
Right.
And so some people wonder, well, if it's hanging around freezing temperature, why don't we have ice on the bay?
Right.
And it's because it's just not quite cold enough yet. But also, very importantly, is there's a lot of latent heat that's built up in the ocean water over the course of the summer. So even if the air temperature is quite cold, it still takes a while for the sea ice to respond. Now, if you had just a little bit of salt water in a dish, it would freeze at 28 Fahrenheit or something like that.
Okay.
But the ocean, to get this bay to freeze out here, we're going to have -10, -15, -20 for a while for it to freeze up.
And we're not quite there yet. It's going to be at least
to go.
a few more weeks at least. Okay. Steve, so maybe we'll wrap up on this question, but we are going to be around for the rest of the day, checking out the comment board online, and then we're around for the rest of the week. Our next official live chat is next week, but we are available. We're going to be plugging in the microphone. We can do voiceovers, and we're going to be answering questions. But for today, to wrap up, how close to extinction are polar bears, and how can we protect them?
Well, the most important thing that we need to do to protect polar bears is to reduce our emissions of carbon dioxide. And what that means is lowering our reliance on fossil fuels. Now, that doesn't mean we won't use oil and gas for a variety of things. We'll be dependent on oil and gas for a long time to come. But we need to be more careful, more judicious in how we use them. And in fact, in many ways, oil is too valuable to burn. I mean, think of our lives without plastics and other things that are products of the hydrocarbon industry. But we need to burn fewer fossil fuels, and we need to contribute less CO2 to the atmosphere. So that's what we really need to do. If we continue on our current path, and that is without doing serious mitigation, serious lowering of the amount of CO2 that we emit. If we don't do anything, we're on a path that could see polar bears disappear in 100 years. I projected that in 2010 in a paper that was published in Nature, and nothing has been published or developed since then that really changes that trajectory. So in that sense, polar bears are severely threatened right now. And one of the things that I like to say is, if you think about it, polar bears in the United States are classified as threatened. They're not yet classified as endangered. But given the fact that we're on a trajectory of them going downhill until they hit bottom, what is the difference between having a species described as threatened versus endangered? You could think about this as if somebody pushed you off of the top of a 100-story building. Are you threatened until you pass by the 10th floor and then become endangered? Or are you endangered from the moment that you fell? And that's kind of the situation that polar bears are in now.
Right. But the great thing is that we can do a lot together to help protect them. Yeah. Absolutely.
And so maybe we could close with this, that we're currently on a path that could see polar bears disappear in 100 years. If we changed our ways, if we actually adopted and set a path towards the goal that was established at the Paris Climate Conference in 2015, if we got on a track and met that goal of keeping global temperature rise below 2 degrees Celsius, we would preserve polar bears over most of their current range. And I think that that's a really important take-home message. We have the ability to do this. We're not on a good path right now, especially in the United States, with our current president having pulled us out of the Paris Agreement and done a lot of other things that are derailing our efforts to minimize carbon CO2 production. But we have the ability, and if we get on that path, we can save polar bears, and saving polar bears will benefit the rest of life on Earth, including us.
Yeah, it really means saving ourselves, too.
That's right.
And check us out. In less than 2 weeks, we will be doing a couple things with the COP23 conference in Bonn, Germany this year. So that climate conference this year will be kicking off. There's going to be a lot of discussions around involvement, I'm sure. And so keep watching, and we'll be talking to you guys about that as well. So thank you so much for all your questions today. Thank you for joining us on Buggy One. We're going to keep rolling. We're going to get you closer to some polar bears. We're here to answer questions online and over the cam in the next few days. And thank you, Steve, so much for being here with us today. It was really big treat for us and for me to have you here to answer these questions. So thanks, everyone. Have a great rest of your day, and we will see you soon.
Thanks for all the great questions.